Hey Leo, welcome back, my beautiful people. Grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's see what's going on here. Now remember, this is a general reading, so take what resonates and leave the rest. Okay, Leo, the energy coming through is kind of wild, because somebody is sitting there right now thinking about things you told them a long time ago. Things they doubted, things they questioned, things they maybe even rolled their eyes at. And somehow, those exact things are starting to play out right in front of them. Honestly, it feels like someone is having a major reality check. Not because you were trying to be right, but because they're finally understanding why you saw things so differently. So let's dive in and see what this energy is all about. The first thing that catches my attention here is the Six of Cups. And this doesn't feel like someone casually remembering the past. This feels much deeper than that. It's almost like their mind keeps drifting back to conversations they thought were insignificant at the time. Random moments, random comments, little things you said that seemed easy to dismiss, but now they're replaying those moments over and over again. It's interesting because I don't feel like they're remembering your words alone. They're remembering how you said them. The look in your eyes, the calmness in your voice, the confidence you carried even when they didn't agree with you. And honestly, that's what keeps bothering them. Because back then, they assumed you were speaking from emotion. Maybe they thought you were overthinking. Maybe they thought you were being dramatic. Maybe they thought you were seeing things that weren't there. But now, life is showing them something very different. I'm seeing this person sitting alone with their thoughts. And every time something happens, every time a situation unfolds, every time someone reveals their true colors, there's this strange moment where your name crosses their mind. Not because someone mentions you, not because they're actively trying to think about you, but because they're realizing, wait, Leo talked about this. And then another situation happens. And again, they're thinking, Leo mentioned something like this before. It's almost becoming impossible for them to ignore. The High Priestess is sitting here, and the energy around this card feels incredibly strong because what they're struggling to understand is how you knew. That's the question that keeps echoing inside their head. How did Leo know? How did Leo see this before it happened? How did Leo recognize something that I completely missed? And I don't think they're finding easy answers. You know, sometimes people assume wisdom has to be loud. Sometimes people think insight needs proof. Evidence, arguments, explanations. But when they look back at you, Leo, that's not what they see. They remember someone who simply observed, someone who paid attention, someone who noticed things that other people overlooked. And honestly, I feel like that's making them respect you in a completely different way. Because they're beginning to realize you weren't trying to control the outcome. You weren't trying to convince anyone. You were simply sharing what you felt, what you sensed, what you understood, and somehow that understanding keeps proving itself over time. Okay, this person feels humbled. That's the word I keep hearing, humbled. Because there was a time when they believed they had everything figured out. There was a time when they trusted their own judgment above anyone else's, especially above yours. And now they're looking around at certain situations and thinking, maybe I wasn't seeing things clearly. That realization isn't easy for them. Especially if this is someone who prides themselves on being logical, independent, strong-willed. Admitting that someone else saw the truth before they did creates a very uncomfortable feeling inside them. But at the same time, it's creating admiration, a lot of admiration. The Strength card keeps pulling my attention. And what's interesting is that when I look at this card, I don't feel power in the traditional sense. I don't feel domination. I don't feel control. I feel grace. I feel patience. I feel someone who didn't need to force anything. Because Leo, whether you realize it or not, I think this person is beginning to understand that your strength wasn't about being louder than everyone else. Your strength was your ability to remain calm when nobody understood you. Your strength was continuing to trust yourself even when other people doubted you. And that is something they are noticing now more than ever. Honestly, I think they're seeing you through entirely new eyes. Not as someone they once knew, not as someone they once understood, but as someone they may have underestimated. Someone whose presence carried far more wisdom than they recognized. And the more these realizations arrive, the harder it becomes for them to stop thinking about you. Because every new lesson seems to lead back to the same place. Every answer somehow circles back to the same person. And little by little, they're beginning to wonder if there was more truth in your words than they ever allowed themselves to believe. Because the more I sit with this energy, the more it feels like life itself has been answering questions they refused to ask before. And honestly, that's where justice starts showing up for me, not as punishment, not as revenge, not as some dramatic moment where somebody gets exactly what they deserve. It feels much quieter than that. It feels like consequences naturally revealing themselves over time. You know, sometimes people make choices believing they'll never have to look back at them. They convince themselves they're doing the right thing. They trust the wrong voices. They follow advice from people who seem confident. They walk away from situations because everyone around them tells them it's the smart thing to do. But eventually, reality begins speaking louder than opinions. And that's exactly what I'm picking up here. This person has been watching certain situations unfold, and they're starting to notice patterns they ignored before. The people they trusted aren't showing up the way they expected. The advice they followed isn't leading where they thought it would. The things they invested their energy into aren't bringing the satisfaction they imagined. And every realization seems to bring them back to you. Because Leo, I don't think you were trying to control their decisions. I think you simply saw where some roads were leading. And at the time, they weren't ready to hear it. Okay, this is where things start getting a little uncomfortable for them. Because when someone begins seeing the truth, they also have to acknowledge the moments they ignored it. And I feel that very strongly here. The tower is sitting in the middle of this energy, and honestly, it feels like a series of wake-up calls, not one giant event. More like several moments happening close together. A conversation that suddenly makes sense. A betrayal they didn't expect. Someone showing their true intentions. A situation falling apart after they spent so much energy trying to hold it together. Little by little, the illusion starts cracking. And what's fascinating is that I don't think they're angry about it anymore. I think they're exhausted. Because maintaining a false narrative takes energy. Pretending something is healthy when it isn't takes energy. Ignoring red flags takes energy. Defending people who keep disappointing you takes energy. And eventually, people reach a point where they simply can't do it anymore. That's what this feels like. Someone reaching the end of a story they've been trying to force into existence. And for the first time, they're allowing themselves to admit that maybe Leo was seeing something they couldn't see. Honestly, I keep hearing the phrase, I should have listened, not necessarily because you had all the answers, but because your intentions were different. When they look back now, they're beginning to understand that you weren't speaking from ego. You weren't trying to win. You weren't trying to prove you were smarter. You were trying to protect them from pain. And that realization is hitting them harder than they expected. Because now they're seeing the pain anyway. They're experiencing lessons you quietly hoped they could avoid. And there's something very humbling about that. Something very emotional. You know, I keep seeing this person sitting with memories and connecting dots. It's almost like they're reviewing old conversations through completely different eyes. Words that once sounded annoying suddenly sound wise. Warnings that once felt unnecessary suddenly feel important. Observations that seemed random suddenly feel accurate, and every connection they make creates another shift inside them. The hanged man keeps drawing my attention because this person isn't looking at the world from the same angle anymore. That's what feels so significant here. They're questioning assumptions. They're questioning beliefs. They're questioning people they've defended for years. They're questioning stories they've told themselves. And honestly, that's not an easy process. Sometimes awakening begins with confusion. Sometimes clarity arrives after disappointment. Sometimes people have to lose faith in something before they discover what deserves their trust. And I think that's where this person is right now, standing between an old perspective and a new one. Not fully comfortable, not fully certain, but definitely different. The version of them that dismissed your insight doesn't feel as strong anymore. The version of them that thought they knew everything doesn't feel as convincing anymore. Something is softening, something is opening. And what's interesting is that this isn't making them feel superior, it's making them feel grateful. Because as they look around, they're realizing how rare genuine guidance actually is. There are plenty of people willing to tell others what they want to hear. Plenty of people willing to encourage bad decisions. Plenty of people willing to support unhealthy patterns because it benefits them. But someone who tells the truth even when it's uncomfortable, that's different. And I think they're beginning to recognize that quality in you. More importantly, they're recognizing how much courage it took. Because telling someone the truth isn't always rewarded. Sometimes it creates distance. Sometimes it creates misunderstanding. Sometimes people walk away. Yet somehow, Leo, I feel like you stayed true to what you felt anyway. And that's becoming impossible for them to ignore. The respect they're developing isn't coming from admiration alone. It's coming from understanding. They're finally seeing what motivated you. They're finally understanding why you spoke up, why you cared, why you kept noticing things nobody else seemed to notice. And honestly, That realization feels like it's changing something very deep inside them. Because for the first time, they're not asking whether you were right. They're asking themselves why they spent so much time resisting what they already felt was true. Because once somebody starts questioning themselves like that, it's very difficult to go back to pretending everything feels the same. And honestly, that's where the Four of Cups starts showing up so strongly for me. This person may be surrounded by people. They may still be going through the motions of daily life. They may still be talking, working, socializing, doing all the things they're supposed to do. But emotionally, something feels different now. Something feels disconnected. It's almost like they're looking around at situations that used to hold their attention and suddenly realizing they don't feel what they used to feel. And that's confusing them, because they keep trying to move forward the way they always have. They keep trying to focus on other priorities, other conversations, other possibilities. Yet somehow their mind keeps circling back to the same place, back to you, back to your voice, back to your energy, back to the feeling they had when they were around you. You know, I keep seeing someone trying to distract themselves, telling themselves they're being ridiculous, telling themselves they need to focus on something else. But the harder they push those thoughts away, the stronger they seem to return. And honestly, I don't think it's only about romance. I think it's about comfort. It's about peace. It's about authenticity. Because when they think about you, Leo, they aren't just remembering a person. They're remembering how they felt around you. That's what keeps resurfacing. They're remembering conversations where they didn't have to pretend. Moments where they didn't feel judged. Times when they felt understood even when they couldn't fully explain themselves. And now that memory feels incredibly valuable, especially after everything they've been experiencing lately. The moon is here, and wow, this energy feels emotional. Much more emotional than this person would probably admit, because outwardly they may still look composed. They may still act like they're fine. But internally, there's a lot happening beneath the surface. A lot of questions, a lot of memories, a lot of feelings they haven't fully processed. I keep getting the sense that certain memories are showing up unexpectedly. Maybe they're driving somewhere. Maybe they're sitting alone. Maybe they're listening to a song. Maybe they're passing a familiar place, and suddenly you're there. Not physically, but in their mind. A conversation returns, a memory returns, a feeling returns. And for a moment, it's almost like time folds in on itself. They're right back in that memory again, right back in that moment with you. And what makes it so powerful is that these memories don't feel forced. They arrive naturally, almost like their subconscious is refusing to let them avoid something anymore. Honestly, I think they're beginning to understand how much space you've occupied in their heart all along. Not because they wanted to admit it, not because they planned it, but because your absence is teaching them things your presence couldn't. Sometimes people don't fully recognize the value of warmth until they're sitting in the cold. And that's the feeling I'm getting here. They keep comparing experiences without even realizing they're doing it. Comparing conversations, comparing connections, comparing how they feel around different people. And every comparison seems to highlight something they miss about you. Your sincerity, your honesty, your strength, the way you genuinely cared, the way you paid attention, the way you could see through things without making them feel exposed, the way you somehow balance truth with compassion. And the more they reflect on those things, the harder it becomes to dismiss what they're feeling. The Nine of Swords is coming through now, and honestly, this feels like the moment where realization starts turning into anxiety. Because thinking about someone is one thing. Recognizing their importance is another. But acknowledging that you may have pushed away someone valuable, that's where things become emotional. I feel like this person is spending a lot of time replaying decisions, replaying conversations, replaying moments where they could have handled things differently. And the frustrating part is that hindsight always feels clearer. Now they can see things they couldn't see then. Now they can recognize things they dismissed before. Now they can understand emotions they were trying to suppress. But understanding something later doesn't automatically erase regret. And that's what feels heavy here. The realization that some opportunities don't look important until you've stepped away from them. Okay, there's something else coming through. This person is afraid. Not necessarily of you, not necessarily of the connection. They're afraid of what happens when they stop pretending they don't care. Because once they acknowledge how much you matter, they also have to acknowledge how much they stand to lose. And I think that's what has been keeping them awake at night. That's what keeps creating this restless energy, this overthinking, this constant mental replay. It's no longer about whether you were right. It's no longer about proving a point. It's becoming something much more personal, much more vulnerable. They're starting to realize that your presence became part of their emotional landscape in ways they never fully appreciated before. And honestly, Leo, the thing that stands out most is that they're not only remembering what you said, they're remembering how safe they felt when you said it. They're remembering the warmth behind it, the care behind it, the sincerity behind it. Because now that life is stripping away certain illusions, those memories shine even brighter. And the more those memories return, the more difficult it becomes for them to imagine a future where they simply stop thinking about you. Because once someone reaches that point, the questions start changing. They're no longer asking themselves why they keep thinking about you. They're asking themselves what they're supposed to do about it. And honestly, that's where the energy shifts again. It feels less like reflection and more like preparation. Less like denial and more like acceptance. Not perfect acceptance, not complete certainty, but enough honesty to stop running from what they're feeling. The judgment card is sitting here, and every time I look at it, I get this image of someone standing in front of their own history. Not the version they tell other people, not the version that protects their pride, the real version, the uncomfortable version, the one that forces them to acknowledge choices, reactions, fears, and mistakes. And honestly, I think that's exactly what they're doing right now. They're revisiting moments they used to justify, moments they used to defend, moments they used to explain away. But something feels different now, because instead of asking, why did Leo react that way? They're asking, why did I react that way? That's a huge shift, a really huge shift, because self-awareness changes everything. I keep hearing this person replay conversations in their head, not arguments, not dramatic moments, just conversations, simple conversations. Things you said that seemed insignificant at the time. And now they're realizing that many of those moments were actually invitations. Invitations to be honest. Invitations to communicate. Invitations to be vulnerable, but vulnerability scared them. Maybe more than they wanted to admit. So instead of opening up, they retreated. Instead of explaining themselves, they became distant. Instead of saying what they really felt, they hid behind silence, distractions, logic, or avoidance. And now they're starting to see the cost of that. Okay. The King of Swords is coming through very strongly here. And what's interesting is that this doesn't feel cold anymore. It feels like somebody trying to organize thoughts they've avoided for a long time, trying to find the right words, trying to make sense of everything they've learned. Because I don't think this person wants to speak from confusion anymore. I think they want clarity. They want honesty. They want their words to actually reflect what's happening inside them. And honestly, that may be one of the biggest challenges they're facing. Because feelings are messy. Emotions don't always fit into neat explanations, especially when someone has spent a long time trying to suppress them. I keep getting this image of them starting conversations in their head, practicing things they wish they could say, imagining different outcomes, imagining different responses. Sometimes they're confident, sometimes they're terrified, sometimes they feel ready. Other times they convince themselves to wait. But regardless of which side wins on a particular day, the conversation itself keeps returning. Because there are things they want you to understand. There are things they wish they had explained sooner. There are things they never properly expressed. And that's becoming harder for them to ignore. The Six of Swords feels emotional here, not because everything is suddenly fixed, but because someone is trying to move away from an old version of themselves. A version built on avoidance. A version built on fear. A version that believed silence was easier than honesty. And honestly, I think they're getting tired of carrying that version around. Growth doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes growth looks like admitting you were wrong. Sometimes growth looks like acknowledging someone else's perspective. Sometimes growth looks like saying, I understand now what I couldn't understand before. And I feel like this person is approaching that space internally, not because they're being forced to, but because reality keeps bringing them back to the same conclusion. Leo saw things they didn't see. Leo understood things they weren't ready to understand. And the more they resist that truth, the louder it seems to become. What really stands out to me is that this isn't coming from a place of embarrassment anymore. Earlier, there may have been pride involved, defensiveness, resistance, but now I feel something softer, something more mature, a willingness to listen, a willingness to learn, a willingness to admit that another person may have been trying to help them all along. And honestly, that realization carries a lot of emotion. Because when someone finally understands the intention behind your actions, they also begin to understand how much care was presented the entire time. I think that's what keeps touching their heart. Not the fact that you were right, but the fact that you cared enough to say something in the first place. You cared enough to pay attention. You cared enough to notice. You cared enough to tell the truth even when it wasn't convenient. And now they're starting to understand the difference between criticism and concern, between judgment and guidance, between someone trying to control them and someone genuinely wanting the best for them. The more those realizations settle in, the more they begin looking at the past through a completely different lens. And honestly, I think that's changing the story they've been telling themselves for a very long time. Because for the first time, they're not only seeing what happened, they're beginning to understand why it happened. And somewhere deep inside, there's a growing desire to make sure their future choices reflect the wisdom they've gained from all of it. Because once somebody reaches that level of understanding, something else begins to change. The focus slowly shifts away from what went wrong and starts moving toward what actually matters. And honestly, that's what feels different here. This person doesn't seem interested in repeating old cycles anymore. They're exhausted by them, exhausted by confusion, exhausted by uncertainty, exhausted by connections that look good on the surface but leave them feeling empty underneath. The Ace of Cups is sitting here, and the energy around it feels surprisingly sincere, not dramatic, not performative, not fueled by fantasy. It feels like somebody quietly admitting to themselves that what they've been looking for may not be as complicated as they once believed. You know, I think for a long time this person associated love with intensity, with chasing, with uncertainty, with proving something, with winning, with overcoming obstacles, with constantly wondering where they stood. But now they're looking at things differently, because all of that effort never really gave them the peace they were searching for. And that's becoming impossible to ignore. Okay, I keep hearing this person asking themselves a very simple question. What actually makes me happy? Not what impresses other people. Not what looks good from the outside. Not what everyone else expects. What genuinely makes me happy? And every time they sit with that question, your energy keeps appearing. Not because you're perfect. Not because they suddenly believe relationships are effortless. But because when they think about you, they feel something they don't feel very often anymore. Peace. There's a calmness attached to your energy in their mind. A feeling that they don't have to perform. They don't have to wear armor. They don't have to constantly defend themselves. They don't have to prove their worth every 5 minutes. And honestly, I think that's becoming more valuable to them than they ever expected. The Four of Wands keeps drawing my attention because this person is beginning to think beyond temporary emotions, beyond temporary attraction, beyond temporary excitement. They're starting to imagine stability. Not necessarily in a rigid way, but in a meaningful way. What would it feel like to build something instead of constantly fixing something? What would it feel like to share life with someone who understands them? What would it feel like to stop running? Those questions feel very present right now. And what's interesting is that they're no longer asking those questions from a place of fear. They're asking them from a place of curiosity. Because for the first time in a long time, I think they're allowing themselves to imagine a future that feels emotionally safe. A future where honesty doesn't automatically lead to conflict. A future where vulnerability isn't treated like weakness. A future where two people can actually support one another instead of competing with one another. And honestly, Leo, I feel like that's one of the biggest realizations happening here. This person is starting to understand that partnership isn't about losing themselves. It's about sharing themselves. There is a difference. A very important difference. The more they reflect on your connection, the more they realize you never tried to take their power away. You never tried to control their path. You never tried to make them become someone else. You simply wanted them to become the best version of themselves. And that realization carries a lot of weight, because not everyone enters someone's life with that intention. Some people want possession. Some people want convenience. Some people want validation. But this person is beginning to understand that what they experienced with you felt different. And honestly, I think that's why they keep returning to it mentally. The Ten of Cups feels beautiful here, not because it's creating some unrealistic fantasy, but because it's showing me a shift in priorities. This person is starting to care more about emotional fulfillment than external appearances, more about connection than image, more about authenticity than perfection. And that's changing the way they view relationships altogether. You know, I keep seeing someone looking back over their life and recognizing how much time was spent chasing things that didn't truly nourish them. Situations that looked exciting, people that seemed important, goals that appeared meaningful. Yet somehow none of those things created the feeling they're searching for now. And that's where you enter the picture again. Not as a fantasy, not as an escape, but as a reminder of what genuine connection feels like, a reminder that being understood is rare, a reminder that emotional safety is valuable, a reminder that trust is built through consistency, honesty, and care. Honestly, I think they're beginning to understand that the future they're imagining isn't built on grand gestures. It's built on small moments, conversations, laughter, support, mutual respect, shared experiences. The simple things, the things people often overlook until they realize how important they are. And what's standing out most strongly is that they're no longer viewing these thoughts as impossible or unrealistic. They're allowing themselves to consider them, allowing themselves to feel them, allowing themselves to acknowledge that what they want may be much closer to authenticity than they originally believed. Because after everything they've learned, after all the lessons, all the realizations, all the uncomfortable truths they've had to face, there seems to be a growing awareness that the connections worth investing in are usually the ones that bring out the best parts of who we are. And every time they reflect on that idea, every time they imagine what a meaningful future could actually look like, your energy seems to find its way back into the conversation, carrying the same warmth, sincerity, and quiet strength that they've finally learned to appreciate in a completely different light. Because at the end of the day, the greatest realization isn't that someone discovers you were right. It's that they finally understand why you said what you said in the first place. Sometimes people don't recognize genuine care until they've walked through the lessons themselves. And sometimes distance, time, and experience reveal what words alone never could. So if this reading found you at the right moment, take what resonates and leave the rest. Thank you for allowing me to spend a little bit of time with your energy today. I appreciate every like, every comment, every story you choose to share here. And most importantly, I appreciate you. Have a beautiful day, Leo. And until next time, keep trusting yourself. Bye, my beautiful souls.